I'm Femi OK. Today on the stream, we are going to look at how millions of people are coping in countries where conflict and insecurity rarely make the international headlines. I want you to stand by if you're on YouTube to ask your questions about the Democratic Republic of Congo, about Yemen, and about Syria. I will do my best to get the guests in the show to answer your questions and to address your comments. We are going to start in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a long ongoing conflict has impacted millions of people in the south and south central part of the country.
Some of the challenges that Congolese people in Congo will have to face currently is the ongoing crisis, the conflicts, the violence, and the killing of Congolese people. And there seems to be an impunity for those responsible for that. This impunity creates insecurities and fuels more violence and more violation of the Congolese people's human rights. In addition to that, there is a coronavirus lockdown, and what this means for a lot of Congolese communities falling into further poverty and famine. As we speak today, there are 21 million Congolese people facing starvation.
Joining me to talk about the Democratic Republic of Congo and the humanitarian crisis there. Hello, Claude. It's good to see you. Tell our stream audience who you are, what you do.
Good evening, Femi. My name is Claude Jibida. I'm originally from Togo. I'm the WFP country director, newly arrived to Chad. Before that, I was in DR Congo and Afghanistan, West Africa, South Sudan, and a number of other countries.
Claude, so you are used to being in challenging situations where conflict is a part of everyday life. Can you just spell it out for our audience, what that means when you live in an area where there is conflict? How does that impact everyday life? How does that stop everyday life?
I think it's wherever there are conflicts, we see people, food security deteriorating. The example of Congo, DR Congo, is really a very vivid example. For me, the situation of food security in this country is nearly a scandal. Let me give you some numbers. In 2016, when I arrived in DRC for the third time, because I've worked 3 times for the last 20 years in the country, the number of people food insecure were 5.9 million. 2017, it went to 7.7, then jumped to 13.8, then 16.1, and today it's 21.8 million. And this is driven by conflict. So, in essence, when I went in 2016, I went to visit some of the IDP, internally displaced people's camp, I had seen before, 17 years ago in North Kivu. And I saw young people, I saw older women, and I knew that some of these kids were born after we had done our distributions in 2017. Others had probably received already WFP's food. And 17 years after, these people were still there, living the same life. Yes, we as humanitarians, we have saved lives. And I think we can say proudly that we have saved many lives. But where we have failed, particularly in the Congo, is that we have not managed to change the lives of the Congolese. And this is directly linked to the conflict.
Claude, I want to bring in 2 voices here because it's the civilians that are caught in the crosshairs of this ongoing conflict. So Gabrielle and Marie are living in displaced people's camps. So in their own country, they are displaced. This is how they explain and describe their situation.
The militia traumatized us a lot with massacres, but since we arrived here a few months ago, conditions have been very difficult. I lack everything. Look where I sleep, on the ground in the cold. My pots are always empty, and there is no one to help us.
The living conditions are difficult, especially for us women. Hygienic conditions are not good here. The most difficult thing is food for the family. Here I've mixed the corn and beans with water, but I need some oil. Everything else is missing too.
So it always seems like the women and the girls are the ones who are the most vulnerable in a conflict situation. How would you describe the help that they specifically need right now?
I think we really need to bring some special attention to the situation of women. I would say all over, but in the DRC particularly. And I I don't know of any other woman on this earth who wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning and work as hard as those women I have seen in that country, from the Tanganyika to the Kasai to the Kivus, and they endure the worst things. The worst things. I mean, you know about all the rapes in the Congo. I mean, the situation of these people is just horrendous. Of course, we all try. The WFP, the other sister UN agencies, the UNICEF, the FAO, UNFPA, the NGOs to try to bring them a maximum. But you can only give what you have in your hands. And I do agree that, yes, humanitarian response is what is needed immediately, because you have to save lives. But I also have concerns about how are we going to change the lives of those people? Because my fear is that from 5.9 million people to 21 million people, we may not be even able to save lives very soon. So
We have
we
some questions
have
for
to
you, Claude.
save lives.
We have some questions for you, Claude. And people are watching on YouTube right now. The gamer says, how is the COVID situation there? And I have one more question, which is about the current presidency. Is it able to handle the crisis that we have in the DRC right now? As you've been describing it, the answer is obviously got to be no, they cannot handle it. But let's talk about COVID first of all.
The COVID is affecting people, maybe not to the extent that we are seeing it in a number of other countries. But you see, the problem with the COVID is that it has some immediate effects that we look at, which is, okay, how are we going to save lives? But I have concerns, and I know many other people much better placed than me also have concerns about how is this going to affect, the socio-economic situation of the Congolese people. Because I know so many people who have lost their jobs because of COVID, because the shops are closed, the restaurants are closed. You don't have billions, in plants, being set up to support the population. So the impact of the COVID is not for me the number of people who are going to die immediately. Of course, it is terrible, but it is how it is going to affect people on the long run. How it's going to affect these 21.8 million in the coming years. That's what the COVID is about. It's about the long term. How is it affecting the people who need a number of treatments? The DRC is plagued with people need access to health. So this is really something that comes on top of an already
On top of
horrendous
a
situation.
whole long list of challenges that you and the people of the DRC are having to handle. Let me point our audience in this direction. Have a look on my laptop. The World Food Programme has a whole page on the DRC, and you can see this headline here: with conflict and COVID-19 deepening hunger in the Democratic Republic of Congo, more help is needed to save millions of lives. Go to that page, have a look on the World Food Programme, of course, and other agencies working in the DRC, so you can get up to date on an underreported story. Claude, thank you for being part of this show. We will catch up with you on Instagram Live a little bit later, but for now, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Femi. Thank you very much.
I want to go to another area, another part of the world where conflict is a major issue, and that is Yemen. The United Nations has described the situation in Yemen as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world.
Yemeni civilians are going through major challenges since war started in Yemen, and especially this year with COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of people lost their main source of income. A lot of people lost their jobs, and a lot of people lost their lives. We definitely need more development projects. We need better access to education. We need better access to high quality healthcare services. We're currently going through a petrol crisis, which is a basic necessity. Yemen needs more development.
Hello, Afra. It is good to have you on the stream under unfortunate circumstances. But Afra, please tell our audience who you are and what you do. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Afrah Nasser. I'm from Yemen, and I work as the Yemen researcher with Human Rights Watch, and I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden.
Afra, if you could sum up the issues that civilians in Yemen are dealing with right now, how would you do that?
I would say it's a non-stop struggle with every basic service that any human being deserves and needs in life. So I salute Farah Al-Wazir. I follow her on Twitter. She mentioned so many problems that one person could face in Yemen, but it's even more terrible for people who are living in villages that really Yemen history has some civil wars and conflicts, but Yemenis have never seen as devastating humanitarian situation as it is today. It's a struggle. It's a multi-front struggle. Just the basic thing that you can imagine, like water, electricity, infrastructure, everything is devastated by years of war. And it's very important to mention from the beginning, this tragic humanitarian crisis in Yemen, it's man-made disaster. It's not natural disaster. It's not out of, it happened out of imagination or anything like that. It's a man-made disaster. Parties to the conflict have really showed disregard to all international humanitarian laws or even basic humanitarian norms in protecting millions of civilians. Farah in the video was talking about many people, but we're talking about millions of people. Yemen's population is about 30 million people, and it's just heartbreaking to see that every household has been devastated and impacted by the conflict.
Afra, I want to give our audience an example. I'm going to tell you if you've got little kids or if you are disturbed by pictures of children who are malnourished. I'm going to give you just a few seconds warning here, because I want you to meet the grandparents of two little boys, Mohammed and Ali, and they talk about what it is like to struggle in Yemen right now because of the lack of food. These boys are basically starving. Have a look.
We fled from the Harad district to here in Hajar after airplanes hit us with 15 missiles. 2 of our people were killed, and we had no alternative but to flee to here. What should we do?
The 2 children were in a difficult condition from the time of birth, and we are working to treat them. One doctor says they have pneumonia, and another says malnutrition. Only God knows.
Afra, I was talking to the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council just a few days ago, and he said Yemen was one of the few places where conflict was happening that he couldn't get his team into Yemen. Getting information out of it, getting people into it is really difficult. There are people who want to help, aid that wants to come in, and it's very difficult. Can you explain what is going on here?
So for about 5 years, I think since the beginning of the conflict, the Saudi-led coalition has imposed a blockade at the airspace of Yemen. Key entries to the country are controlled fully or partially by the Saudi-led coalition. So mobility from outside to inside the country has been extremely difficult. The logistics could take weeks, months, sometimes years. For Yemenis to travel inside the country has been a grueling and exhausting activity. It's it's so difficult to move inside the country or even have an access to go to the country. And for humanitarian organization in particular, I think this is completely unacceptable because we are dealing with the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. And yet parties to the conflict, mainly the Houthi armed group that controls the largest part of the north, where the largest part of the population live in the north under the control of the Houthi. And yet the Houthi group has created grueling and exhausting network of obstacles against humanitarian groups.
Afra, people want to ask you a few questions. I'm going to ask you to answer them very swiftly, if you don't mind. Abra Khan, how is the education and living situation in Yemen?
The education, in just brief answer, has been devastated by the conflict. We are at risk of losing a generation. If not, we already lost them. There are so many dropouts from schools because schools were bombarded by airstrikes or were severely damaged by the armed groups on the ground. So even schools have not been saved of the violence.
One more from Mitchell DeVilo. Just ask very directly, is the constant foreign intervention in the conflict prolonging conflict in Yemen?
That's a very important question. I think what needs to happen in Yemen is a multi-layered approach, regionally, internationally, and locally. Everyone has to come together really and find a political solution that could end the suffering of millions of civilians in Yemen. The international role is so important, the regional role is so important, the local is so important. Everyone has a stake at Yemen, and they have responsibility towards what's happening in Yemen.
I want to add one more comment to your brilliant analysis, Afra, and this is from Waleed, who really sums up why the authorities are struggling to help their own people. Have a listen.
The main challenge that Yemen has been facing is the economical situation, which has been collapsing rapidly. You start to notice a huge shortage within the educational and the health sectors. And with the corona crisis, when the corona crisis started, both governments really exposed. They were not even able to offer to afford people with symptoms or high symptoms corona tests. And with the lack of awareness, people didn't really trust them, and they either denied the whole cholera crisis or refused to get the medical treatment in public hospitals.
Afra, I know the stream audience well. They do not like to hear a list of problems without at least one solution. In a sentence, what would that be?
That's a very difficult thing to do, but I'll try. I think the best aid that Yemen needs today from anyone who's trying to help is really to push for the respect of international humanitarian law in Yemen. We in Human Rights Watch very often publish reports asking for states to, for example, suspend their arms deals to parties to the conflict. So I urge the audience really to take their government accountable for their role in what's happening in Yemen. The best aid one of the best aid that Yemen needs today is really the respect of international human rights and international human rights law in Yemen.
Thank you for being on the stream today to talk about Yemen, an underreported story that really needs to be on the news a lot more. Afra, thank you.
Thank you.
Finally, we go to Syria, where the government and armed forces are now in the 10th year of a civil war. And meanwhile, as Syria heads into winter and the winter conditions make life very difficult for people who are displaced, 9 million people are facing extreme hunger, and there's COVID pandemic to deal with as well.
This year has been an even more difficult year for Syrians, hard to imagine but true, especially for the 4 million Syrians living in northwest Syria, people who still face military bombardment. On top of that, trying to cope with living through the global pandemic, COVID has spread through Syria, from the IDP camps to crowded cities and villages, taking the lives of hundreds of people, especially of Syrian doctors and healthcare workers who have already become a rare commodity after 10 years of war, have really shattered the healthcare system.
Dr. Zahul, thank you for joining us here on the stream to talk about the situation in Syria. Please introduce yourself to our audience and tell them what you do.
Thank you for having me. And before I speak, my heart goes for the people of the RC and Yemen. I've been in Yemen multiple times in the last 2 years, in the north and the south, and the Yemeni people deserve our attention, like people going through disaster. My name is Zahir Sahlul. I'm a critical care specialist practicing in Chicago. I'm Syrian American. And also I'm the president of MedGlobal. It's an NGO that focuses on healthcare in disaster regions like Syria, Yemen, Gaza, Bangladesh, Colombia, and other places. And I've been in Syria multiple times. Last time was early this year when there was a huge displacement of the population in northwest of Syria because of the bombing by the Syrian regime. And I visited camps that Lena has spoke about them, and the situation is horrible. This is probably the worst humanitarian crisis in our lifetime, not only this year.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring in the voice of Al Hakam, who really puts together the crisis with the personal, almost the sociological issue of what happens after 10 years of conflict and who is suffering. Have a listen to his thoughts. I'd love you to bounce off the back of them.
In Syria today, temporary conditions are turning into long-term reality. Of the about 13 million displaced Syrians, only a minority have felt safe to return home. Around 2 million of them remain in what's called Greater Idlib, where olive orchards have turned into hastily built cities. 100,000 remain forcibly disappeared, mostly in regime prisons, where now with COVID conditions are even worse. And COVID deaths and the strain it has put on hospitals is reminiscent of the days of the bombing. Refugees are nowadays learning of the deaths of their parents without having seen them in many years.
So what is urgently needed right now in Syria?
What's urgently needed in Syria, like many other places that are ignored, is attention. I think the worst thing when you have a humanitarian crisis in this scale is the apathy and not paying attention. An end of the crisis, because we can have band-aids for the refugees and for the displaced and sending food here and there, but unless we have a political will and the major power, especially the United States, especially with the Biden administration and the UN, to end the crisis politically, then we will continue to face and see horrible pictures and videos from Syria. What happened in Syria has affected the whole world. The refugee crisis that led to 6.5 million refugees destabilized the region, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and of course Europe, created huge anti-refugee sentiment in Europe, hate groups, terrorism, and this will continue. The Syrian crisis will haunt us like the Yemeni crisis if we do not pay attention. And of course, what's needed is a humanitarian assistance that at this point that to the millions of people in Syria who are in need for medical assistance. I visited one of the refugee camp inside Idlib earlier this year, and I asked one of the women who was displaced with her 6 children, what do you need? And she said everything. People are in need for attention, they need for food, for shelter, for healthcare.
Dr. Zahur, it's interesting listening to the issues in the DRC, in Yemen, in Syria, all fueled by conflict, all politically created, almost man-made situation, that the answer is right there, right in front of our very noses. Thank you so much for talking to us about Syria today. We wish you every success with your work. So, have a look here on my laptop. I want to show you what we're doing next on Instagram Live. We have Instagram Live conversations at the AJ Stream account on Instagram Live. You have to be there in order to take part in these conversations. They happen Sunday through Wednesday at 20:30 GMT. You may remember him from a little bit earlier in our conversation. This is Claude Jibida. He is the country director for the World Food Programme. We will be digging a little bit deeper into the situation in the DRC. You've got questions, you've got comments. We will see you on Instagram Live from Monday at 20:30 GMT. Thanks for watching. See you next time.